So I'd like to welcome everybody to the last class in the series on progress and poverty, Henry George's most notable work, his first one published in 1879. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go over a little bit of the book number 10, Roman numeral 10. Even though Ron Rubin did an excellent job presenting on book 10, he's got a summary, and I'll just show it briefly. You can get this online, and you can read that. I'm going to quote a few things from his summary that comes out of the Progress and Poverty. But Class 12 was meant to be going over the final book and then do a summary of the whole text. That we started back in September 19th, I think was the day, September 19th, 2018. And looks like we're having a problem with the slides, so let me pull that up. And for you who are joining on the YouTube, there are slides that you can pull up from the website, www.hgsss.org. So let me get started. Today is April 23rd, 2019, and we've got an audience here. Let me, oh boy, looks like we're going to be battling the slides. So this is our last class. We celebrate the wonderful journey we've taken, and reading a document that has inspired so many, yet created a powerful reaction to it. Looks like I'm going to be, the thing keeps on locking up, so I think what I'm going to do is just read from my slides.
Do you have a PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Use the PowerPoint.
Oh, yeah, maybe. Oh, yeah, that was the problem. Yeah, last time we tried to do the PowerPoint, the PDF, and okay, let me do that. So if you can hold on a second. Yeah, forget that. That was something that Ed Nill learned about. Yeah, everything's kind of backwards. Okay, PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, I think we're in good shape now. So this is our last class. For each of the 10 books of Progress and Poverty, a summary is provided that follows the development of George's argument, and that's essentially what we did in each of these 12 classes, the ones that preceded this. Developing the argument the way he did was pretending that he was he wasn't supporting any view one way or the other, but he had a logical way of speaking and saying, let's look at population, let's look at wages, let's look at capital and labor and land, and made the case for what he came to conclude. So I hope through this whole experience you enjoyed it, and go back and reference the videos and the slides in the future. So there's something that Henry George said where he said, there are people into whose heads it never enters to conceive of any better state of society than that which now exists. I can say that we have a lot of people here today that say that, who imagine that the idea that there could be a state of society in which greed would be banished, prisons stand empty, individual interests be subordinated to general interests, and no one seek to rob or oppress his neighbor, is but the dream of impracticable dreamers, for whom these practical level-headed men who pride themselves on recognizing facts as they are have a hearty contempt. And then Henry George concludes, but such men, though some of them write books, and some of them occupy the chairs of universities, and some of them stand in pulpits, they do not think. That was on page 464 of the Progress and Poverty. And right now, if you're following along with the slides online, we're on slide 3. I'm going to slide 4. I'm going to be making the case of what Henry George preached. And my position is that Henry George makes socialism superfluous, because with the solution that Henry George promoted, socialism wouldn't be needed, because we would be getting the wealth that society requires through the ground rents. Just as a point of information for people who are not familiar with Henry George or the movement that he created called the Single Tax Movement, there's a book by Arthur Nichols Young, and if you get these slides, you can see the link. But it's 1916. Just Google it. It's an excellent summary of the movement and how the book was published and what people did after Henry George died, like in the 1910s and 1920s. It's a very interesting history. So one of the things that Henry George actually said, I was the one that said Henry George makes socialism superfluous, but I think it's funny in today's politics, April 2019, George may not be called a socialist correctly, but by his standards and what he proposed, he said that his remedy realizes the dream of socialism. So interesting use of words that Henry George had. That was page 456, he said that. So on page 7, and I'm going to do a little introduction of some of those major ideas, and I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on his circular flow of wealth, which comes out of book number 3. But one of his main ideas in Progress and Poverty was that rent depends on the margin of cultivation or production, rising as it falls and falling as it rises. He has other descriptions that relate to wages and interest, but it's rent that's different than the other two. And we all know that the margin of cultivation is at the edges where the wages can be gotten without the payment of rent. So it's the margin where you're getting by, where the good fertile land is already taken and you're at the edges of production. So wages depend on the margin of production falling as it falls and rising as it rises. Same way with interest. So you can see in this diagram that he's talking about, and this is covered throughout the text, that he talks about how if you have a situation where the landowner is extracting rent, that comes out of the wages and interest. So that's the benefactor of the Henry George ideas, is to give the capitalist his due and the labor his due in the wages. So another thing that he says that's paradoxical, that the emergence of liberty from feudal bonds has been accompanied by a tendency in the treatment of land to a form of ownership which involves the enslavement of the working classes. So he's trying to poke the finger in our eye, saying that we think we're all high and mighty and we've got liberty and freedom, no longer like the feudal system, but here we are, slaves to a system where there's private property and land and people keeping others from the enjoyment of the natural opportunities that are due them for being a person that living on the planet. So in the next 3 or 4 slides, I boiled down the circular flow of wealth that you can get exactly from the book number 3. And the first one is a simplistic diagram showing the use of land and labor, very little capital, where you have a man behind some ox with a yoke. And typically in this kind of arrangement, the landowner and labor would share the product of the agricultural system there. And like I said, without much capital. But once you get into a mechanized situation with agriculture, that's where you have, capital, land, and labor, the 3 factors of production. And this is the way Henry George saw the economy. It's different than the way that the economy is described in the standard textbooks on economic science. You see replaced consumed capital to keep the capital in good shape. That's going to come out of the production or produce, the way he described it. Land goes to the landowner. This is the system that was described. And then he has a true wages fund, and the true wages fund goes into the discussion about where does labor's wages come from. And he spends many pages talking about the fact that wages do not come out of capital, that any capitalist would not do that. He would generate interest, which is return on capital, and that would be what goes into the true wages fund. And then the production flow of wealth, where we're starting to get into the terminology of Henry George, where he's saying that production, which is adapting, which is manufacturing and transporting, growing and exchanging. So all these things production doesn't need to come out of a factory, that instead you can adapt, you can grow, you can exchange, and this is all part of production, and this is what he's describing. And this is like a two-dimensional view of the flow of wealth, which now we introduce the concept that Henry George had, is that, well, if you want to stop the cycle of depressions because of the boom and bust cycle, if you just go to option 2 on this slide number 12 in the PowerPoint slides, the rent that would go to the landowner goes to pay for the infrastructure services. And Henry George, in Social Problems, he identifies 20 examples of infrastructure services that include gas and water and heat, electricity, public library, public school, public health, recreation goes on, deepening the riverbed, issuing money, and reducing the appropriative power of aggregate capital, which is the duty of government. So this could be seen as government services and infrastructure services. And this is the unique insight that Henry George had when we're talking about the flow of wealth. And the people who benefit are the community, where the rent would be going to option 2 for infrastructure services, for health care and all the other things that take care of the social maladjustments, the way that Henry George described them. And just for anybody who wanted to follow the citations of where I got the pages and the information about land, labor, and capital, and rent, interest, and wages. You can follow this diagram. A very important diagram, and this goes into the diagram I got here on page 15, because on page 15, what I'm showing is an overlay of the private sector and the community sector. And this is an important point, and I'm going to cite several texts that go outside of Progress and Poverty at this time, just to give you a sense of where Henry George fit within the science of economy or economics. This statement that I was going to read now is posted on the website. The title is How George Fits or Doesn't Fit Within the Science of Economics. And I'm using the same slide, so keep in mind that I'm going to refer to that. So when discussing progress and poverty, we must focus on the book within its historical context. 1879, Henry George dies in 1897. This is about the time when the neoclassical economics takes its full breath and goes forward in time. And as we know, that within the Henry George community, that the neoclassical economic approach to economics conflated land into capital, which essentially discounted everything that Henry George was trying to get at about natural opportunities, and kind of takes a lot of the wind out of the sails of the Georges, let's say. So George is recognized as the last major promoter of classical economics with his distinctive separation of land and capital. But that may have been a divergent point meant to discount the real value of his message. True, George preceded the takeover of what was political economy at his time by a science of economics based on a mechanical equilibrium as a sweet spot, supply and demand both optimized. But if you read George carefully, George talks instead of dynamics and threshold conditions. Threshold conditions, for example, of achieving the land value tax, or achieving the revenue for taking care of the social maladjustments. Him and later economists talk about thresholds, including Kate Rayworth in her book on donut economics. So more importantly, George was an early promoter of infrastructure asset services as part of the state-managed economy. And this is a significant point of trying to understand Henry George within the panoply of economists. The community sector, the state-managed economy, as separate and distinct from the private economy. This is what I call the economics of cooperation. And this is the title of a book that I'm working on right now to address this important finding. Because I think this, we need to understand exactly where Henry George fits in, because he doesn't fit in with the scope of a neoclassical economist. And I think most people would want to understand where Henry George fits in within this economics as it's taught today. So George called these services the infrastructure services, which include water and transit, power, roads, education, police, healthcare, all these social adjustments that are needed. When they are lacking, they're called social maladjustments. By taking speculative ground rents out of the economy, George essentially kills two birds with a single stone, unleashing productivity by relieving capital and labor from the burdens of taxation, replacing those revenues with captured land value, that which no individual owns. It is socially created wealth. The other bird is land value paying for the other economy that is hidden from the analysis for decades. State-managed infrastructure assets until Eleanor Ostrom's formulation of a common pool resource management system, where small to large scale cooperative enterprises organize to sustain a social good. So what I'm getting at is that Henry George was a predecessor of the concept that Eleanor Ostrom and even Kate Raworth had on how to formulate a community sector, a cooperative sector, state-managed infrastructure services. Even if privately supplied government, even if it was privately supplied, these services, government does set rates for approved monopoly suppliers of electrical power, natural gas, cable services, and those kind of things. Government fails when these services are mismanaged, and a lot of people talk about New York City's MTA being mismanaged. Well, you know, we need to look at where the revenue goes for MTA, and I think there's some things that Henry George would say, and the Henry George School of Social Science would say in that regard. So right now I'm going to turn to, and I'll show a copy of the book, John Kenneth Galbraith, 1962, American Capitalism. This book does a real good job successfully matching the various countervailing powers, sometimes by government, such as the 1930s New Deal, thus unmasking the flaw in economic science in those times of the 30s, 40s, and 50s that would have you believe that the private economy was self-regulating despite a few monopolies. They were supposed to be the exception. So Galbraith explains the phenomenon of Keynes as something others spoke of but did not grab the attention as Keynes did. In a nutshell, economic policy consisted of cutting taxes and or increasing government spending in a recession to boost demand. And this is on page 178 of Galbraith's book. Then increased prices and increased wages would be countered by higher taxes and lower governmental expenditures, all while private industry carries on. And this is the point that Galbraith makes about Keynes in his book, that Keynes comes to the rescue of the private sector firms by creating a medicine for others to take. So it was an effort to rescue private firms and private enterprise from the depression and the recessions that were in place in the 30s, but preserving the private sector. And this is the point that I'm trying to get at, is what economics was really focused on, was allowing the private sector to be self-regulating. Well, Keynes came along and said, well, do these things and the private sector will carry on. Now, going to the next book that I wanted to talk about very briefly before we go back into the progress and poverty is Alfred Chandler. He has a book called Scale and Scope, The Dynamics of Industrial Capitalism. And I'm bringing these up just to give you an idea of where Henry George fits in within the economic science. He provides an exhaustive analysis of the economies of the US, UK, and Germany from the 1890s to the 1970s. I think if you ever had any questions about those three countries and how they adapted and performed, that's a go-to book. I recommend it highly. We're all familiar with economies of scale, but those of scope. So Chandler talks about economies of scope. Most of us are not familiar with that concept. Simply put, scope means emptying the box of parts of an economy and putting them together in new ways. Not the same way, but bigger, that you get with the economics of scale. Significantly, he points to Germany's culture of cooperative management of the economy as a factor benefiting its national wealth and its position in the as industrial leader. I bring all these things up to clarify that I see as unique in George's writing and say that George was 100 years ahead of his time. He didn't describe the economy in monetarist terms as Keynes, Galbraith, and Chandler does. In Progress and Poverty, you see a genius saying, have your private economy without monopoly power. Make your private economy thrive with no taxes on business. That would make people in private industry happy. Recognize the power of labor to initiate the production of wealth and honor that role with no taxes on income. And the last is take control of land values to fund those things productive capitalists, laborers, and citizens equally need: infrastructure, asset, services. This is the economics of cooperation. So that's the little breakout that I wanted to do as I'm looking at the private sector overlaid on the community sector. Because as you see in the diagram just before that on slide 14, you've got a flow of wealth, and what connects the community sector and the private sector is the rent going to infrastructure services, because both economies depend on good roads, good communication, good electricity, all these things that drive people to cities. Why people move to New York City, they might like the parks, they might like the fact that it's relatively safe, it's beautiful, those kind of things. Schools are relatively good. There's always room, but that's what we're doing at the Henry George School Social Sciences, looking at ways to improve the economy. So with this overlay, I'm saying that it's a three-dimensional financial flow, and we see that on page 15. And I throw in a circular flow diagram from Heilbronner and Thoreau from 1976, just to show the, I call it banal simplicity of how the economy is supposed to work. In fact, in this diagram here, let's see, this is slide 16, they talk about supply and demand being addressed, but the government has no role here. Very big oversight, because Henry George saw the role of the state in providing the response to the social maladjustments, which includes poverty and homelessness and those parts. So very quickly, I wanted to also show how Henry George fits into the economy. A very good book, and I'll hold it up right now. It's called After the Crash, Designing a Depression-Free Economy. It's Mason Gaffney. There's 3 articles that he wrote. But even if you just read the introduction by Clifford Cobb, you come away with some very excellent insight into Henry George and what can be done to make the economy better. So because economists treat rapid changes in real estate prices as an epiphenomenon, not a causal factor in economic crises, the remedies do not take land speculation into account. And this is, 140 years after Progress and Poverty, you still have economists getting it wrong. Instead, they concentrate exclusively on solutions that are aimed at changing financial flows following Keynes. And this is what I talked about in the monetarist approach, not looking at shaping the economy to serve a purpose, but just to finagle interest rates and government spending to get the economy in a certain way, kind of like with sticks and gates and doors and stuff. Ultimately, their ideas can all be traced back to hydraulic metaphors. This book was written in 2009, shortly after the crisis. So in his description in the introduction, when an economy slows down, conventional economic wisdom says that something is clogging the pipes. This is on page 12 of that introduction. The remedy lies in blasting water, which is money, through the pipes to enable them to flow freely again. The conventional responses to this to the crisis by mainstream macroeconomists are cut interest rates to promote investment or run a fiscal deficit, which is borrowing and government spending. So to abolish the taxation which acting and reacting now hampers every wheel of exchange and presses upon every form of industry would be like removing an immense weight from a powerful spring. So you can see the difference in the way that Henry George describes the economy from the current thinking of economists today. He's talking about these metaphors of power, dynamics, and he's laying out what the solution is. It was a solution 140 years ago. It's a solution today. It'll be the solution in 40 years. So the question for the Henry George School and its students is, why aren't we getting what we all know is needed? Because we don't have to wait 40 years. We already know what the solution is. So this is Henry George. We're going to go through the books, the 10 books, and highlight some significant things that Henry George wrote. And we'll have to say that before I prepared this class and taught this the class week after week since the fall, and we had guest instructors as well. But until I sat down and read the actual text, I really didn't get the appreciation that I thought I had. It takes some effort to read the actual words, because you get the analogies and you get time to follow the argument. So on wages, I mentioned this before, about there is no wage fund that the capitalist has to pay laborers. This is a false concept that is used to belittle laborers. But in fact, laborers initiate wealth production. I put down this joke on the bottom. If you ran a lemonade stand, would you sell your lemons to pay wages to your sister? Now, this is kind of like a funny way of describing the situation. Of course you wouldn't sell the lemons, because the lemons are what you need to make the lemonade so they can sell. Once you sell it, then you can pay your sister. And this is really no different than what Henry George was saying, is that there's no fund. Like, I'm not going to go sell lemonade and have a stack of dollar bills I'm going to pay my sister. What I'm going to do is sell it, earn a profit, and then pay my labor. And capital. So what, in terms of what Henry George thought, he said he preferred what Adam Smith said, that which affords a man with revenue or wealth devoted to procuring more wealth. So a capital is wealth used to create more wealth, and that's the point that he's getting at. So what Henry George is doing in Progress and Poverty is going step by step, defining terms, so that you don't, oh, somebody told me capital was something else. No, you have to read Henry George, write down your little notes that capital is wealth used to create more wealth. Then you don't have to listen to anybody else. You can understand the point that Henry George is making. What, after going into what is not capital by some of the economists at his time, George says what's important is first to ascertain what a thing is before settling what it does. And that was the problem with economists in his time. His time was that people were saying, well, this is what capital does. Well, Henry George said, well, let's figure out what capital is. One of the things that is important in economics is this rule that you never borrow money unless it's for capital purposes. For example, you would never borrow money so that you can ship garbage from New York City to Ohio or Pennsylvania, North Carolina, wherever New York City's garbage goes to. You might borrow money to buy a new garbage truck to collect the garbage, but you wouldn't do it just for the disposal. It's for revenue generation. So what is wealth? Interesting that Henry George said that mortgages are not wealth. The point that he was trying to make was that if you've got a situation where a bank holds the mortgage and you're the one that's paying off, with the stroke of a pen, that wealth could evaporate. And he was saying those are examples where mortgages are not wealth. One of the points in the financial crisis that we witnessed in 2007 and 8 was that there was a lot of wealth in those mortgage-backed securities, which were based on the homes and speculative rents, and those were traded. And so instead of focusing just on the homes themselves, the investments that were being made, which eventually collapsed, were based on rents and the expectation of paying those. And I guess maybe just really quickly, it was interesting that that I was reading Clifford Cobb talking about there was a misnomer that the 2007-8 crisis was a subprime mortgage crisis. He was saying that there was like 5 counties in the United States where maybe 50% of the crisis and the over-leveraging was made. And it was at the further end of the problems that the banks were finding that they couldn't service these loans. And that's when they opened the doors to the low-income people to get them to get sucked into this scam, which is a very very depressing idea that intentionally bankrupt poor people, giving them false hopes. So rent. Rent is the return received by the landowner for the use of the land. And you saw in the simple example of the farmer with very little capital, that was a typical way that wealth was shared. So book 1, Wages and Capital, continued. Chapter 3, 4, and 5. Wages produced, wages labor produced. As he labors, he is advancing capital to his employer. The employer never advances capital to him. So an example in the book had to do with workers are building a tunnel, and the wages are being paid for the advance of the tunnel through the rock. So if you say, well, what did I pay for? Yeah, I paid for my labor, but here's what the laborers gave me, a half-finished tunnel. So that was the example Henry George was using. Maintenance of laborers. Wealth is no longer capital, and we're on slide 31. Wealth is no longer capital. Wealth used to procure more wealth. When articles of wealth pass into the hands of the consumer for the gratification of desires, regardless of whether the consumption aids in production. So this is the idea of a product on the shelf at a store is capital, but as soon as the consumer buys the box of Band-Aids, then that is no longer capital. Maintenance of laborers, community. And throughout Progress and Poverty, you're going to read community, cooperation, working together. And in the book 10 that I'm going to get to, the association of with equality, you're going to find out that at the end of the book, Henry George is going to say, what's the law of human progress? So he's getting beyond economics, and he's saying that the association with equality is the law of human progress. So he talks about community here. In larger units of people, there develops a sense of mutual interest. And this is getting back to the idea of the state-managed economy with the infrastructure, where people in the present divide and exchange food with those whose efforts are directed to future recompense. Infrastructure. The modern government undertakes great work of years. It does not appropriate it to wealth already produced, but wealth yet to be taken from the producers and taxes as the work progresses. And again, he talks about community. The machinist's labor actually exerted in the production of the engine virtually produces the things in which he expends his wages. That was on page 76, slide 33. So that was book one. You know, we got 9 more books to go, but I think I laid the foundation for, you know, for understanding progress and poverty. And nobody should be using this slide or this presentation as a substitute for reading. It should be read the book, watch the slides, watch the video. So in book 2, we get into Malthusian theory and disproving that population is not a problem for a progressing society. In fact, we lose out when population does not increase. Henry George points out that it is a very fact that want appears where productive power is greatest and the production of wealth is the largest. That constitutes the enigma which perplexes the civilized world and which we are trying to unravel. Evidently, the Malthusian theory that there's a problem with population consuming a fixed supply of resources, which attributes want to the decrease of productive power, will not explain it. So the book 3, we get into laws of distribution. And like I was saying, I'll kind of skim over book 3 because that goes into the development of that circular flow diagram, the way I described it with the private sector overlaid with the community sector, connected with the infrastructure services. So land, labor, and capital are the factors of production he gets into. And in returns to these 3 factors is the whole produce distributed, rent, wages, and interest. These terms are mutually exclude each other. And that's the difference between the economics of Henry George and other branches of economics, that his terms are, you know, separate and distinct. So there's an order of understanding the laws of factors of production. There must be land before labor can be exerted. So land is primary. Labor must be exerted before capital can be produced. And then capital, instead of being first, is actually last. Instead of being the employer of labor, it is in reality employed by labor. That's page 162 in Progress and Poverty. And we're on slide 39. On slide 40, we get into more on the laws of distribution, where labor is the active and initial force, and the natural order is land, labor, and capital. And once again, I show the flow of wealth that Henry George implicitly describes that I've captured on this PowerPoint slide on slide 41. So in book 3, we have the last half of the laws of distribution. And he talks about spurious capital, a new and essentially different power from the power of increase of capital we call interest. The large masses of capital, I labeled it LMC, are more insidious than protective tariffs. Losses of capital acting as a monopoly force to rob the powers of labor and business. So he reiterates that labor employs capital and not the other way around. So here's an interesting claim, and he was getting at it, looking at an example of Indian tribes in the United States, Native Americans. Can a weapon maker of the tribe claim 6 or every 7 buffalo killed with a new weapon? I think he was trying to show that technology advances, but the person who made the original weapon doesn't claim the extra income that's being generated by the person using the technology. So he was saying that the advance in the arts has created a common property. And very importantly, this is not efficiency. So it's not like using the same tool and making it bigger or making more of them. It's a phase change. And this is the repeating concept in Henry George, that it's dynamics. It's not a mechanical, it's not equilibrium. There's thresholds. And every time you get into a new advance in the arts, technology, when we got the computer and now we're getting into 5G, there's an advance in the arts. This is a common property. And in reality, the 5G electromagnetic spectrum, this is land in Henry George's terminology, and we should be deriving a rent from that. Now, whether that happens is something that a Georgist would have to get involved in and get into policy. But anytime you have any questions about what I'm talking about, call the Henry George School of Social Science and talk to Ibrahima Drame and others who are on staff. Real briefly, this is my view of looking at the phase change that Henry George gets into. I laid it out in terms of hope and crisis, that at the high point of crisis is when you get, for example, you're collecting the ground rent. So you're going into a new way of society, that it's no longer a equilibrium. It's like you're pushing the edges so that you can get more of the community wealth. And that's the point of this diagram. You can see that as you move farther to the right, you increase hope and decrease crisis. So it's more than taking so many steps forward and so many steps back. Even before, on the left side of the maximum crisis, there's a sense that you're increasing the crisis, but you're increasing hope because you know that there's something on the other side of the apex. So the law of interest, rather than reading all these things on slide 47, Henry George talks about rabbits multiply faster than horses, but prices decline on quantity. So if somebody was very simplistic, thinking that, well, I can sell so many horses, but it takes so long for horses to grow up, maybe I should grow rabbits, but rabbits don't sell for as much money. So he was just talking about the law of interest. So if you're looking at things to invest in, look at the price you can get and the value from the labor that you're putting into it. So interesting insight, and these are some of the benefits you get from reading Progress of Poverty. Labor is stored up in matter as heat of the sun is stored up in coal. Kind of an interesting way of looking at it. But that's the kind of thing that you try to sell your boss, that I'm not just a person working this job today. My contribution to what we do in this business that I'm a laborer in, I'm allowing future people in the future to not have to relearn what it is that I learned. I had an acronym. It's see how many words is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So Henry George has this phrase. It's got 10 words in it. MSTGTDWTLE. Men seek to gratify their desires with the least exertion. So if you wanted to stump anybody who thinks that they're a Georgist, ask them what the fundamental principle of human action is. And you just think, MSTGTDWTLE. Men seek to gratify their desires with the least exertion. So what he's saying is that fixed wages at the produce of such labor at the highest natural productiveness open to it. So men and women, don't typically look to find harder ways of doing the same thing. And that's essentially what he was saying. That based on that principle, that's how you look at labor and production and other aspects of the economy. So the political economy of 1879, which is the same thing today, views the law of distribution of wealth. Henry George is saying that there's no common center, no mutual relation, not correlating divisions of a whole, measuring different qualities. And that's what his problem with the way that economics was taught back at his time. But with George's laws of distribution, on the other hand, the laws spring from one point. They support and supplement each other, form correlating divisions of a complete whole. And that's the contribution that Henry George is making here in book 3. So just like the Copernican theory gave simplicity and harmony to the actual system, which is a sun-based solar system, Henry George is giving that simplicity and harmony to economics. And it's not the total produce, but the net produce after rent is removed that determines what can be divided as wages and interest. So it's the same point that he keeps on making, is that if we can capture the land value, that there's more to be shared in terms of wages and interest. And this is the same point that I made very early on, the statics of the problem explained. About the value of land being low, wages and interest are high. So it's that inverse relationship between rent on the one side and wages and interest on the other. So we get on to book 4, and we're going right through this thing. The effect of material progress upon the distribution of wealth. So the changes which constitute or contribute to material progress are 3. And this is on page 56 of the slides. We've got 119 slides, so we're pretty close, about half, but some of them are going to go kind of quick. So the changes which constitute or contribute to material progress: increase in population, this is refuting the Malthusian theory, improvements in the arts, or production and exchange, and improvements in knowledge, education, and government, which I term the infrastructure asset services, the state-managed economy that Henry George gets into. But he includes police, manners, and morals, so far as they increase the power of producing wealth. So this is I think the key to everything that I was trying to describe in that wealth flow diagram, is that these the social adjustments that are made and paid for by the rent, from the ground rent from the landowner, who typically gets it now. What you're doing is providing those kind of things that increase the power of producing wealth. So for example, if every business was given the fastest internet service imaginable, and they got it for free just because they lived in New York City, or they had the most respectful police force that always looked after people and they didn't discriminate, all those kind of things that you really want. Safety, roads without potholes, transit that doesn't have any delays. You know, these are the kind of things that he's talking about. Material progress, distribution of wealth. So distribution of wealth doesn't mean necessarily standing on a street corner and handing out food stamps or other kind of vouchers. It could be producing the services that people need and making the economy go. So as considered, considered in the light of material forces or economies, the increase of knowledge, the betterment of government, et cetera, have the same effect as the improvement in the arts. It will not be necessary in this view to consider them separately. So we are at present dealing with material progress to which these things contribute only as they increase wealth producing power. And this is what he's getting at in book 4. So book 5, this is the presentation that Ibrahima made, and I summarized a little bit. The problem solved, the primary cause of recurring paroxysms. This is the boom-bust cycle. Persistence of poverty amid advancing wealth. So Henry George talks about on page 263, the speculative advance of land values cuts down the earnings of labor and capital and checks production, is the main cause of periodic industrial depressions, are increasingly liable. And on 265, it says, the new cycle would then begin at a new equilibrium where once again the speculative rent line would overtake the normal rent line, production checked, and another depression. So we've got the summary of what's happened in the past. We've just experienced a similar speculative rent line, and we know that they're going to happen in the future. The fact that the Georgia structural reform has not been adopted widely in the United States suggests that the last recession is not really dead, that the speculative event and rent is still advancing. And I guess that's something that we're going to have to see. So to be clear that this speculation concerns, it's not speculation in things. So in 2007 and 8, it wasn't a mismatch of supply and demand as much as can be settled like an action of a flywheel with that mechanical approach to the economy. Rather, it's speculation in land. That was what was behind the 2007, 2008. Speculation expressed as rent. So to blame otherwise is kind of like blaming the ocean's low tide on the withdrawal of a few buckets of water. So he's making very clear that we need to look at the bigger picture. So society should be advocating for the increase in the productive power of labor. And he identifies all these ways to do that. Growth of population, increase and extension of exchanges, discoveries of science, march of invention, spread of education, improvement of government, amelioration of manners. And he makes the point that free trade without checking speculation fails the labor. This is on page 287, and we're on slide 63. So he puts it very clearly what he identifies as the primary wrong, and it's the speculation in land. Free trade is something that he finds as being necessary, but it's secondary importance. So the next class we had combined books 6 and 7, and we're going to be talking about the remedy and then the justice of the remedy. And book 6 is very interesting, and it's something I think to almost memorize the basic points, because what I'm going to show in a minute, he lays out, here's 5 solutions to economic problems. And number 6 is the remedy that he identifies, which is capturing land rent. Just to point out, so that you don't get suckered into somebody saying, well, you're all, Henry George might have been smart, it was 140 years ago, but what you really need to do is focus on unions, for example, or you might focus on forming a cooperative, and I'll show you how he gets into that mindset. Okay, so 6 classes of remedies. Greater economy and government. Is poverty the outcome of aristocratic or monarchical institutions? Well, economy and government is a good thing. However, as long as land is monopolized as private, wages will be less and poverty more. So no matter what you do in making the government more economical, unless you go to the sixth class, you're not going to get there. Better education, industry, and thrift. Sometimes when I see the Dell commercial about technology and what a smart city would be, I think about this chapter, this book, 6, because he's making the point that better education, industry, and thrift won't get you there. Don't we often hear of the impoverished? Apply yourself, be frugal, get training. It's your own fault, the mess you're in. But the truth is, as land acquires a value, wages do not depend upon the real earnings of or product of labor, but upon what is left to labor after rent is taken out. So no matter what you do, there's always that little person at the end of the game, the robber who takes all that's left, is the way it's described in the book. I think it's free trade and protection. So he points out the next class of remedy, unions. Combination of workers can eat into the expense of rent. So Henry George is not totally against the idea of unions. He sees a role that unions can play. But for you to say the unions and combinations of laborers as the solution, that if we could have the best union in the world, we're still not going to get there, because like he says, that rather than take recourse, they step back to a community view and work to collect the values due from the use of the land. So the gain or loss, it disappears when the entire community is taken into account. So people within the union might benefit, but you look at the entire community and there might be a loss. So he's not saying he's against unions, he was saying it's an inadequate remedy. So 6 classes of remedies, and we're on slide 68. So the next one is dear to my heart, cooperation, because I think that's the secret to Henry George. But cooperation in and of itself is not the remedy that Henry George is getting at, even though he uses that word a lot. There is cooperation in supply and cooperation in production. In supply, cooperation reduces the cost of the middleman. In production, cooperation substitutes proportional wages for fixed wages. So each makes it easier to produce more with less labor. Unless the theft of rent is addressed, poverty cannot be lessened. So you might buy something at Walmart or those kind of big box stores like BJ's and such. But at some point, you're not going to get all the way there. Governmental direction and interference. So this is get into his idea of tariffs and other kind of factors. Back in Henry George's time, the effects of regulation were called socialistic. Anytime the government would say you need to modify how you do your business. Absent governmental direction is individual freedom. Interesting that Henry George opposed the graduated income tax, even though single taxers in 1913 pushed for it. But so these are all classes of the remedy that don't work. So this is his drum roll and hitting the cymbal, more general distribution of land. As we've been saying from the beginning of this course on progress and poverty, a just distribution of land goes after the source of wealth that society creates. Let's discover what is the communities to have. And as we are seeing with the left turn of many Democrats in 2019, going toward the 2020 election, is George's thought the current of the times. And it's something that we need to think about as a Georgist movement. So the true remedy, after a review of all the remedies for the end of poverty short of the abolition of private property, each is inefficacious or impracticable. So making common ownership of land is the only thing that will end poverty. In nothing else is there the slightest hope. And maybe at this point, maybe I need to identify that we're not talking about nationalizing land. What we're saying is that because of the tradition of land use, that the solution that a Georgist would advocate today would be that who's occupying land should take full advantage of his occupation, but it's the land value that is owed to society, that the person monopolizing that plot of land is something that is owed back to society. So Book 7, in conquering lands, rights do not oblige, but create a force to compel others what to do. So people who are conquering lands have power, but they don't have a right. So that's the idea behind the injustice of private property. Rent expresses the exact amount which the individual should pay to the community to satisfy the equal rights of all other members of the community. And this is this is one of these gems that you get for reading Progress and Poverty. Has the first comer at a banquet the right to turn back all the chairs and claim none partake unless on his terms? So the idea that you move into a city and you say, well, I'm going to direct how this city develops. I'm going to own this. I'm going to own that. Essentially turning back the chairs and saying that nobody can live there. And a Georgist would say, no, turn the chairs back. People have a right to be there. But if you do want to turn the chair so that nobody's there, you pay for that opportunity. And that's the point that Henry George is making. And labor enslavement, and he makes this analogy quite often. The Southern slave owner might have felt self-justified that his slaves were well fed, south of the Mason-Dixon line, compared to the laborers in the northern slums. So Henry George is saying that in the northern slums, you got progress amid poverty and poverty among progress. And you have laborers who are doing more poorly than somebody who's a well-fed slave. The law of supply and demand drives the lower classes to slavery, to want. It's on page 357, Progress and Poverty. We're on slide 76. And he makes a point that emancipation of slaves are in vain. Our freedom involves slavery so long as we recognize private property in land. Expediency and justice demand that we abolish private property in land. It has no broader base or stronger ground than a mere municipal regulation. So it's fine and dandy to have rules about private property, but you need to understand that there's nothing more behind it than a municipal regulation, which a new mayor can come in and say, I'm going to change it. So in a lot of cities that has happened, Vancouver, for example, is considering a land value tax. And so once you realize that there is this paper tiger sitting there that we have to respect I'm going to have to put this on. Alana's trying to call me. Expediency and justice demand that we abolish private property. Alana, I'm teaching a course right now. Let me call you back in about an hour. Okay, see you. Okay, compensating thieves. This was the idea that John Stuart Mill had, was that, well, all these people own this land, let's pay them what they deserve because they bought it. And George says, no, 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 we don't compensate thieves, which is owning private property. So this is another interesting gem. Private property and land fills brothels with girls who might have known the pure joy of motherhood. It's one of my favorite. In fact, I might bring that up in the board meeting. George cites the Dred Scott case, where a northerner who purchases a slave's freedom had no claim to another's land. So that was an interesting example on page 366, and we're on slide 79, where this was before the Civil War, but it was a northerner who purchased a slave's freedom, but the southerner could come in and claim it because the slave is essentially land, property. And he was bemoaning that situation. So just resume ownership and allow the former landowner to retain improvements in personal property. So the government enforcing and the city would take possession of the common land, and the person who's been on that land can retain improvements and the personal property on that. So the history of land, we're still on book 7, slide 81. Nowhere has unrestricted individual ownership been freely adopted. And this is what Henry George was talking about, how land is initially taken hold of. Private property and land is robbery, its birth in war and conquest, page 370. Now, interestingly, on slide 82, George cites the example in Switzerland, the Swiss almonds, as an example where land is held in common. And this is the exact example that Elinor Ostrom uses in her 1990 book, Governing the Commons. And I guess I'm known for trying to connect Henry George with Elinor Ostrom, and here's an example on page 373 that makes that connection. So there are ways of commonly owning property. So also on the history of land, slide 83, interesting analysis of the fall of Rome, that a rotten Rome had been propped up by the healthier life in the frontiers until such time that the rot consumed the fringes of the frontier. So it's almost like the Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, and you know the situation where the Roadrunner runs someplace and the coyote is out there wiggling his feet, and he looks and then he falls. So this is the situation where Rome was rotting at the center, and it took time for that rot to spread to the edges, because on the edges was where you still had a sense of the economy operating. But this is the inequality, and I think that was a point that he was making, is that, and he makes this, and I'll be getting this in a second, is that wherever there's inequality, that's where civilizations start to decline. It doesn't have to be. All the civilizations that we know that have collapsed happened because we tolerated inequality. And then you had people on the edges saying, we don't have to put up with this. So then you have barbarians and others who are on the margins of society and start again. But it doesn't have to be that way. That's the point that he's making. It doesn't need to be that way because we have a solution that Henry George talks about over and over. Interesting, in the California gold rush early days, the primitive ideas of community land ownership prevailed until the passage of a law permitting the patenting of mineral lands. So what Henry George talks about in book 7, chapter 5, about a situation where the miner could only claim ownership of what he could actually mine, pan, for the gold. If he says, oh, I got the next 50 feet and there's nobody there, somebody had a right to come there and take their shot at trying to get the gold. So we get into Book 8, the application of the remedy. So application of the remedy, there's a delusion resulting from the tendency to confound the accidental from the essential. And anybody who's familiar with Book 7 would know about Ho-Ti's burning house. If you don't know that example, I'm going to say it in a second. That private property and land is necessary to the proper use of land. That's the argument that's used. But this is as false as the idea of how do you cook roasted pig? So there's a situation, a story that Charles Lamb, a historian, talked about Chinese after that a pig was accidentally discovered in the burning house of Ho-Ti's hut. That it was necessary to get a cooked pig by setting a house on fire. So the idea is that, oh, you want a cooked pig? Well, let's burn somebody's house down. You don't need to do that. The same argument is that you're talking about that private ownership of land is the only way that you're going to get productivity. It doesn't need to be that way. Thus, it is a common matter for use to be separated from ownership. And this is a situation like we discussed in the Amazon seminar that we had several weeks ago, where the state of New York was acquiring private land under the footprint of Amazon in Long Island City, and at some point handing that land over to Amazon, which totally was unnecessary, and is really a good reason that the deal didn't go through, because so easily the state could have retained ownership of that land and acquired the rent, which is similar to what we're talking about here about the state or the city owning the land and renting it out. So you can separate ownership with use. So Book 9, we're getting near the end. Book 9 is the effects of the remedy. So the effect on the production of wealth. Interesting an analogy or a story out of the Bible, Deuteronomy 25:4, where it says, refraining from muzzling the ox that treadeth out the corn. So allow the ox to eat the part of his labor while he treads out the grain. So don't screw over the laborer trying to squeeze the last bit of gain out of the work that he's doing. Allow the ox to eat the part of the corn that's coming out, that he might bend over and eat some of the grain. Just a normal way, or maybe a natural law idea. So every productive enterprise, besides its return to those who undertake it, yield a collateral advantage to others. Today, we might describe this as a positive externality, but I don't like the word externality, because positive and negative things in the economy should be part of the whole circular flow of wealth. In fact, if you've got a good economy, you should intentionally do good things, like, for example, make it easy for students to learn, easy to take advantage of a nice environment. You know, that's the collateral advantages. Nobody's actually making a buck off of doing it, but you do it just because that's the culture that you have. And that's essentially what Henry George is getting at in his book. Henry George talks about the benefits others, production benefits others besides those who get the direct profits. He says that nature laughs at a miser. With George's remedy, the selling price of land would fall, land speculation would receive its death blow. So the selling price of land would go low because you're not profiting on the land itself. The person who might occupy that space and pay the rent would be putting up an insurance office or some kind of bank or other type of tech industry. And that's how he generates the money that pays the land rent that goes to the city to produce. So if you're not being productive, you really shouldn't be on the land that you're sitting on in the middle of the bustling city. So Book 9, Chapter 1, placing all taxes on the value of land is like putting up the land at auction. And this gets to the point that Steve Taft makes in his book. Speculators would be taxed as much as though his lands were covered with houses and barns, and would pay for the privilege. Essentially, this is what happening in the building that's boarded up at the corner of 3rd Avenue and East 38th. We learned from James Cusick that the person who owns that plot is paying $250,000 a year for the right to speculate. And in that sense, we have a form of a land value capture system without having it. And that's the thing I want to explore in a future seminar, but it's interesting. Paying for the privilege. Chapter 2 of Book 9, slide 96. George calls infrastructure asset services public burdens. Infrastructure asset services is my term, but Henry George calls it a public burden. He's recognizing that these burdens like water supplies, security with police and education, healthcare, the advantages of a land tax cannot be fully appreciated until we consider the effect on the distribution of wealth. Public burdens distribute wealth. So it's a burden to distribute the wealth. Destroy this inequality by taxing the whole of rent to promote equality. So if there was any doubt about how much of the ground rent should be taxed, Henry George talked about getting it all 100%. Wealth then would be divided into two portions, wages and interest, then to the community as a whole, distributed in public benefits to all its members. So Book 9, the enormous advantages of a dense population would be united with freedom and equality. It is so unnatural and absurd, the spectacle of men who have only a few years to live, slaving away their time for the sake of dying rich. Henry George had a nice way of promoting the common man, and I really like that one. Take a man who has bought some boots. Is he a loser when the price of boots fall? He was trying to get at the idea that the value of land would go down. But if somebody just bought a pair of boots and the price of boots goes down, I mean, what's he going to do? He already bought his boots, and he bought them because he was getting satisfaction and what he needed. So the idea that somebody bought land and now it's worth less, well, they should be generating their interest, their return on capital on what they're doing on that land. Maybe if they needed some help for a period of time, we'd reduce the rent while they're getting started or something, but the idea that the government needs the revenue from the land value. And this is something that should have been read by the persons in the Georgist movement in the 1910s, 1920s. That's recalled in the book by Young that I pointed out from the beginning. Georgists going out into the agricultural sectors trying to promote Henry George. And the farmers got up in arms because somebody lied to them saying that, oh, they're going to tax your farmland and leave the people in the cities alone. And they're going to string them up and hang them. Henry George makes the point that agricultural areas would be lightly touched. And I think if I was back in 1910, 1920 on this crusade for Georgia's single tax, I would focus on cities. He was very clear on that. The non-producer would no longer roll in luxury because he's not getting the extra that he's getting. And we'd get this benefit called the strain of saving the strain in the courts. Much of their business concerns disputes over land ownership. Get rid of judges, bailiffs, clerks, prison keepers, and the great host of lawyers whose talents are wasted. Let them turn to higher pursuits. I can't think of a nicer thing to say. Page 455, Progress and Poverty, slide 104. Like, once you implement a Georgia solution, you have all these savings. With this remedy, we realize the dream of socialism, not through government repression. We're getting near the end. We're on book 9. George identifies these infrastructure assets as their services. And once again, in addition to the social problems, he identifies some more infrastructure assets on page 456. In this one, he includes music and dancing halls as assets and services. Roads lined with fruit trees. Discoverers and inventors rewarded, all for the public benefit. Government would administer a great cooperative society. So these are some good things to say about what Henry George was talking about. So the wealthy man is admired in our society. You know, look at Donald Trump. I think a lot of his vote went because he's a successful businessman. So wealth is admired, but it is not in the guise of a hideous monster that Satan tempts the children. Another gem. And I point out consider the debates about the African charity and the pressing need of national development in African countries, which is another point we can make later. Short-sighted is the philosophy which counts on selfishness as the master motive of human action. So, you know, you can't say that Henry George was 100% Adam Smith devotee. So much for the invisible hand. Talking about we shouldn't be counting on selfishness. He's talking about cooperation and community. So it's interesting. Self-interest is a mechanical force. Human nature is a chemical force which melts and fuses and overwhelms. So where self-interest is mechanical, human nature is a chemical force, melts and fuses and overwhelms. Human nature is the electricity of the moral universe, which is another gem that he talks about, page 462 on slide 107. We are made for cooperation, like feet, hands, eyelids, like the rows of upper and lower teeth. This is the philosophy of Henry George. We need to unite the capitalist and the laborer in the same person. And this is the true entrepreneur, and I think this is what he was getting at, is to assume a cooperative form. So what do we do with all these improvements? We would have shorter work hours, more intellectual occupations. Henry George is a early promoter of maybe a universal wage, where he's talking about work would become a lightsome thing, less monotony, less productive forces going to waste. So he wasn't worried about giving people a benefit where you're getting the same salary where you were working 40 hours, now you're working 20. This is some pretty advanced stuff 140 years ago. Page 468, he talks about that. Now finally, book 10. And once again, I want to point out that on the website, you can get the handout that Ron Rubin passed out on Book 10, a very good summary that I'm going to highlight a few things on. So Henry George says on page 471, I have now traced to their source social weakness and disease. I have shown the remedy. I have covered every point and met every objection. But the problems that we have been considering, great as they are, pass into problems yet greater, into the grandest problems with which the human mind can grapple. I am about to ask the reader who has gone with me so far to go with me further into still higher fields. But I ask him to remember that in the little space which remains of the limits to which this book must be confined, I cannot fully treat the questions that arise. So that was the summary, but in Ron's summary, I wanted to just read, just kind of like summarize what Book 10. So Book 10 is, what is the law of human progress? So Henry George makes a very convincing argument about what economics is and where the revenue should go, revenue should come from, and where it should go to increase the productive powers of society. And I guess what I want to do, maybe in conclusion, is just quote what Henry George says. What is the essentials of progress, human progress? Association in equality. So it's association with equality is a better way of describing it. Justice and freedom. Now, as in a separated state, the whole powers of man are required to maintain existence, and mental power is only set free for higher uses by the association of men in communities, which permits the division of labor and all the economies which come with the cooperation of increased numbers. Association is the first essential of progress. Improvement becomes possible as men come together in peaceful association, and the wider and closer the association, the greater the possibilities of improvement. And as the wasteful expenditure of mental power in conflict becomes greater or less as the moral law which accords to each an equality of rights is ignored or is recognized, equality or justice is the second essential of progress. So association and equality. And that's a pretty good summary of Book 10. And here we are with the progress and poverty summarized. We've got a video, we got slides, we got handouts. So you have all the resources. I think people who are watching this YouTube video should now crack open an original copy of Progress and Poverty and start reading it. And you might be able to find those gems that I pointed out. So look for upcoming events at the Henry George School of Social Science. We've got a course coming up on the social entrepreneurship. We're going to be talking about congestion pricing. We got a lot of things coming up, so a lot of exciting things. So visit the website and study up, come to our courses. And my name's Marty Rowland, and I appreciate the time you spent listening to this seminar, and I hope you do well in your studies. Thanks.